Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when the rivers of early America were not peaceful ribbons of water, but vast, breathing corridors of uncertainty, places where darkness didn't just fall. It settled in like a living thing. At first, you don't notice the river. It's not because it isn't there. It's because everything around it feels the same. The land is dim, the sky is dimmer, and the thin line between earth and water disappears as dusk begins its slow descent. You're standing somewhere along the eastern frontier, sometime in the early 1700s. There are no lamps stretching into the distance, no hum of electricity, no distant glow from towns. Only the fatting warmth of the sun slipping behind dense forests. The river at this hour doesn't sparkle or shine. It absorbs light. It becomes darker than the land around it, a slow-moving shadow stretching across the earth. During the day, it might have looked inviting, useful even. A source of drinking water, a path for travel, a place to wash, to fish, to rest. But at night, all of that changes. You feel it before you fully understand it. The air near the river cools faster than the surrounding land. A damp chill creeps into your clothes, into your skin. It's subtle at first, just enough to make you shift your weight or pull your coat tighter, but it deepens with every passing minute. The sounds change too. Daytime noises, birds, insects buzzing in the sunlight fade away, replaced by slower, more deliberate sounds. A splash. You turn your head, but you see nothing. The water looks still, but you know it is. Something moved. Something always moves. Early travelers often wrote about this feeling, though not always directly. They didn't describe fear in the way modern people might. Instead, they described unease, a sense that the river was never truly empty, even when it appeared calm. Especially at night, you step closer to the edge, though you're not entirely sure why. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's habit, or maybe it's the simple fact that the river, even in darkness, pulls your attention toward it. The bank beneath your feet is uneven, soft in places, firm in others. Mud clings to your boots. There's a faint smell rising from the water, something organic, something ancient. Not unpleasant exactly, but heavy. The surface shifts again. This time you see it. Not clearly, just a disturbance, a widening circle where something touched the water. It could be a fish. It could be a turtle. It could be something larger. In the early American wilderness, rivers were home to more than just small creatures. Beavers worked silently in the dark. Large fish drifted beneath the surface, and in some regions, alligators slid through the water with almost no sound at all. But what makes the night unsettling isn't just what's in the river. It's what you can't see. During the day, the water offers clues, ripples, reflections, flashes of movement. At night, those clues vanish. The river becomes a kind of blindness stretching across the land. You can hear it, smell it, feel the coolness it brings, but you can't read it. And for people living centuries ago, that mattered, because rivers weren't just scenery. They were roads, Long before railways and highways, rivers were among the most reliable ways to travel through dense wilderness. Canoes and small boats moved along these waterways, carrying people, supplies, and news. But traveling at night was rarely a simple choice. It was something you did only when necessary, when delay meant danger, or when daylight hours weren't enough. If you were in a canoe now, the experience would be even stranger. The water would feel closer somehow, as if it were rising up around you. The gentle rocking of the boat would become more noticeable in the dark. Every small movement, every shift in weight, would echo through the wood beneath you. The paddle dipping into the river would sound louder than it should, each stroke breaking the surface with a quiet but undeniable rhythm. Dip, pull, lift, and then silence again. No distant engines, no artificial noise, just the steady pattern of your own movement, surrounded by a darkness that seems to stretch forever. Sometimes the river itself made sounds, not loud ones, not dramatic ones, just quiet, persistent noises, the soft lapping of water against the shore, the faint creak of branches brushing together above, the occasional hollow knock of driftwood shifting in the current. These sounds didn't form a clear picture. They didn't tell a story you could easily understand. Instead, they created a kind of uncertainty, where every noise felt like it might mean something, but you couldn't be sure what. And then there were the banks. During the day, the edges of the river were visible, defined by soil, grass, roots, and stones. At night, they dissolved into shadow. Trees leaned over the water, their branches forming uneven shapes against the sky. Some looked like figures standing still. Others seemed to move when the wind touched them. If you stared long enough, your mind would begin to fill in the gaps. Shapes where there were none, movement where there was only stillness. This wasn't imagination in the playful sense. It was something more practical, more instinctive. Early travelers had to remain alert. The wilderness wasn't empty, and the riverbanks were often pathways for animals. Deer moved quietly through the underbrush. Predators followed them. Even something as simple as a raccoon stepping near the water could sound much larger in the dark. Another splash. Closer this time. You hold your breath without realizing it. There's a moment, a brief pause, where everything seems to stop. Even the air feels still, as if the world itself is waiting. Then, slowly, the sounds return. The soft movement of water, the distant rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of insects beginning their night. You exhale, but the feeling doesn't leave. This was one of the defining features of early American rivers at night. The sense that you were never alone, even when you couldn't see anyone or anything around you. It wasn't always fear, exactly. It was awareness. A constant, low-level alertness that shaped how people moved, how they rested, how they thought. Campfires, when they were used, became small islands of light in an otherwise endless dark. If you were camping near the river, the fire would cast a warm glow over a limited space, just enough to see your immediate surroundings. Beyond that, everything would fall away into shadow. The light didn't push the darkness back very far. Instead, it seemed to emphasize it, creating a sharp boundary between what was known and what wasn't. The river, just beyond the edge of that light, would remain mostly invisible. You might hear it more clearly now, the gentle flow, the occasional shift, but you wouldn't see much of it. And that could be more unsettling than standing at the bank itself, because now you weren't just facing the river. You were turning your back to it, sitting with the knowledge that something vast and unseen lay just beyond your view. People in that time developed habits because of this. They chose camp locations carefully. They avoided certain stretches of river where the banks were too steep, too muddy, or too enclosed by dense forest. They listened to everything, and they learned to distinguish between sounds that mattered and sounds that didn't. But at night, that distinction wasn't always clear. A simple ripple could sound like a large animal entering the water. A falling branch could echo like footsteps. The human mind, especially in low light, tends to prepare for the worst. It fills silence with possibility. You shift your position slightly, feeling the ground beneath you. The earth is cooler now. The last traces of warmth from the day have faded. Above, the sky is darker than you expected, far darker than modern skies, untouched by artificial light. Stars begin to appear, faint at first, then sharper as your eyes adjust. They reflect on the river's surface, or at least they try to. The current breaks the reflections into fragments, small, shifting points of light that flicker and disappear. It's not a steady mirror. It's something more unstable, more uncertain. Even the stars seem unsettled here. Time moves differently in this environment. Without clocks, without artificial schedules, you rely on subtle changes, the position of the stars, the deepening of darkness, the gradual quieting of certain sounds. Night doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, layer by layer, until the world feels entirely different from what it was just a few hours ago, and the river changes with it. What was once a clear path becomes an unseen presence. What was once a resource becomes a question, and what was once familiar becomes something harder to understand. You sit there for a while longer, listening, not because you expect something to happen, but because listening is the only thing you can do. The river doesn't reveal itself easily at night. It doesn't offer clear answers or simple reassurance. It simply continues, flowing past you, just as it did during the day, just as it will long after you leave, unconcerned with your presence, unchanged by your thoughts. And yet, somehow, it feels different, heavier, closer, as if the darkness has given it a kind of depth that wasn't there before. Eventually, you realize something. The unease isn't coming from the river alone. It's coming from the combination of everything: the darkness, the sounds, the limits of your own vision, the awareness of how little control you actually have in this environment. Early Americans didn't just travel through landscapes like this. They adapted to them. They learned their rhythms, their patterns, their silences. But that didn't mean the nights became easy. It just meant they became familiar. And familiarity, in a place like this, doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes, it simply means you understand exactly how much you don't know. The fire crackles softly behind you. The river moves quietly ahead. And the night, vast and patient, continues to settle in around everything. The night does not deepen all at once. It settles in layers, quietly reshaping everything you thought you understood just an hour ago. You remain near the riverbank, though now you're less certain why you chose this spot. The ground beneath you has grown colder, and the dampness has begun to creep upward, slowly working its way through fabric and into bone. It's not sharp discomfort, it's gradual, persistent, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but refuses to be ignored. The fire behind you has softened. Its earlier brightness has faded into a steady glow. The flames lower now, occasionally flickering higher when a piece of wood shifts or collapses inward. Shadows stretch longer across the ground, bending and moving in ways that feel almost intentional. Every now and then, a spark rises into the air and disappears, swallowed by the dark before it can travel far. Out beyond that circle of light, the river continues its quiet movement. You don't see it clearly anymore. Instead, you track it through sound. The gentle, continuous flow, the faint lap against the shore, and sometimes something else, something irregular, a disturbance that breaks the rhythm just enough to draw your attention. Another splash. This one lingers, not because it was loud, but because it was followed by a second sound, a soft dragging, like something shifting just beneath the surface. You find yourself leaning slightly, trying to listen more carefully, as if your ears might reveal what your eyes cannot. Nothing follows, just the return of that steady, almost hypnotic movement of water. It's easy in moments like this to forget how much life these rivers held. During the day, that life was visible, understandable. Fish near the surface, birds along the banks, the occasional animal coming down to drink. But at night, everything changed positions. Creatures that hid during daylight hours began to move more freely. Patterns reversed. Silence became a kind of cover. You shift your gaze toward the tree line. It's darker there, thicker. The branches above form uneven shapes against the sky, blocking out what little starlight filters down. Somewhere within that darkness, something moves. A faint rustle, then stillness. It could be anything. That's what makes it difficult. The human mind prefers certainty. It wants to name things, categorize them, understand them. But here, that instinct doesn't always help, because most of the time, you don't get enough information to form a clear answer. Early travelers learned to live with that uncertainty. They didn't investigate every sound. They didn't chase every movement. Instead, they observed patterns over time. They learned which noises repeated, which ones faded, which ones demanded attention. A single rustle might mean nothing. A series of them, spaced just right, might mean something more. You hear it again, slightly to the left this time. A movement through dry leaves, careful, but not entirely silent. It pauses, then continues, then stops again. There's a rhythm to it, not random, but not entirely predictable either. You remain still, not out of fear exactly, but out of caution. Movement in a place like this carries. Even the smallest shift can be heard, can be interpreted, and you don't know what's listening. The river, for all its uncertainty, is only part of the environment. The banks are just as important. They serve as pathways, as meeting points, as places where land and water life intersect. Animals come and go throughout the night, following instincts older than any map or road. They know where the ground is firm, where the water is shallow, where the safest crossings can be found. Humans, at this point in history, are still learning those things, and sometimes they learn the hard way. You glance back at the fire. For a moment, it feels reassuring, something controlled, something understood. But even that comfort is limited. The light only reaches so far. Beyond it, everything remains unchanged. The river does not brighten. The trees do not become clearer. The darkness simply holds its ground, unmoved by your small attempt to push it back. There's a reason many avoided traveling rivers at night, unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't just about visibility. It was about interpretation. During the day, a bend in the river could be seen from a distance. A fallen tree, a cluster of rocks, a narrowing channel, these things could be identified, navigated, avoided. At night, those same features became hidden hazards. You might hear water moving differently, but by the time you understood why, it could already be too late. If you were in a boat right now, you would feel that tension constantly. Every shift in the current would matter. Every sound would carry weight. The paddle in your hands would feel heavier, not because it changed, but because your awareness of it deepened. Each stroke would be deliberate, careful, measured. Dip, pull, lift. The sound echoes softly across the surface, then fades. You would find yourself listening between strokes, trying to detect changes. A faster current, a sudden quiet, the faint echo of water hitting something solid. These were the clues early river travelers relied on, especially when sight failed them. And sometimes, even those clues weren't enough. You turn your attention back to the water's edge. There's a subtle shift happening there, something you might not have noticed earlier. The mist. It begins as a thin layer, barely visible, hovering just above the surface. But as the night cools, it thickens. It spreads slowly, drifting outward, blurring the already faint boundary between land and water. This was common along many early American rivers, especially in warmer months. The temperature difference between the water and the air created these low, creeping fogs that moved silently across the landscape. They didn't rush. They didn't announce themselves. They simply appeared, gradually altering everything they touched. Now, the river isn't just dark. It's obscured. The faint reflections of stars disappear entirely, replaced by a dull, shifting gray. The opposite bank, if there is one within view, vanishes. The world feels smaller, more enclosed, even though nothing has physically changed. Your hearing sharpens in response. That's a natural reaction. When one sense becomes less reliable, the others compensate. You begin to notice smaller sounds. Now, the faint crackle of the fire, the soft brushing of fabric as you adjust your position, the distant, almost imperceptible movement of something stepping into shallow water. Another splash, but this one is different. Heavier, slower. It's followed by a low, spreading ripple that you can't see, but can almost feel through the air itself. There's a presence to it, something with weight, something that displaces more water than a fish or a small animal would. You don't move, not immediately, because movement would be a decision. And right now, you don't have enough information to make one. This is what nights along these rivers often demanded: patience, restraint, and acceptance of incomplete knowledge. Early accounts don't always describe these moments in detail, but when they do, there's a pattern. A recognition that the river, at night, operated on a different set of rules. It wasn't hostile, exactly. It wasn't deliberately dangerous, but it was indifferent in a way that could feel unsettling. It didn't adjust itself for human presence. It didn't become easier to understand. It simply continued, as it always had. The sound fades. Whatever caused it moves on, or settles, or disappears beneath the surface. You can't be sure which. The mist thickens slightly, curling over the water in slow, uneven patterns. The fire shifts again behind you, sending a brief flare of light that stretches out toward the river before retreating once more. Time passes, not in a way you can measure precisely, but in a way you can feel. The kind of passing that settles into your body, making your limbs heavier, your thoughts slower. Fatigue begins to mix with awareness, creating a strange balance where you are both alert and distant at the same time. This, too, was part of the experience. Nights were long, without artificial light, without constant activity. People rested more, but they also remained aware of their surroundings in a different way. Sleep, when it came, was often lighter, more fragmented, especially near places like this. You listen again. The river is quieter now. Not silent, never silent, but steadier. The irregular sounds have lessened, replaced by a more consistent flow. The mist has settled into a thicker layer, smoothing out the surface, softening edges, reducing contrast. It almost feels calmer, but you've been here long enough now to understand something important. Calm doesn't always mean safe. Sometimes it just means that whatever was moving has already moved on, or that you've simply stopped noticing the smaller changes. You glance upward. The stars are clearer now, brighter against the deep darkness of the sky. Without the interference of light, they seem closer somehow, more numerous. They stretch across the sky in patterns that early travelers often used for guidance, for orientation, for a sense of direction when everything else felt uncertain. But here, near the river, even they feel slightly distant, because your attention keeps returning to the same place. The water, the unseen movement beneath it, the quiet, persistent reminder that something is always happening, even when you can't observe it directly. You shift slightly, adjusting your posture, feeling the stiffness that has begun to settle into your muscles. The ground presses back against you, firm and unyielding. The air carries that same cool dampness, steady and unchanging. And the night continues, not dramatically, not with sudden changes or clear events, but with a slow, deliberate persistence that reshapes your awareness moment by moment. This was what early American rivers were really like at night. Not constant danger, not endless action, but a steady, quiet negotiation between what you could sense and what you couldn't. And as you sit there, listening to the river breathe in the dark, you begin to understand why so many people, even those who depended on these waterways, chose to wait for daylight before moving on. Because here, in this moment, with the mist thickening and the sounds softening and the world narrowing around you, you're not just traveling through the wilderness anymore. You're sharing it. The longer you remain beside the river, the more the night begins to feel less like a passing phase and more like a place of its own. It's no longer simply the absence of daylight. It is weight now, texture, a presence that settles over the land and changes how everything behaves, including you. Your body has adjusted in small ways without you noticing. Your breathing is slower. Your movements are more deliberate. Even the way you listen has changed. You're no longer reacting to every sound, but absorbing them, letting them form a kind of quiet pattern in your mind. The river continues, steady as ever, but now there's something else. A faint, distant sound, so subtle at first that it barely registers. It's not from the water directly, and not from the immediate tree line either. It comes from farther along the river's path, carried unevenly through the mist and over the surface. You pause, focusing. It comes again, a hollow, irregular knock. Then silence. It's easy to misinterpret sounds like that. Early travelers often did. Water carries noise in unusual ways at night, bending it, stretching it, making distant things seem closer and nearby things seem far away. What you hear isn't always where it actually is. Still, your mind begins to work through possibilities. A piece of driftwood striking against something solid. A loose branch caught in the current. or perhaps a canoe, somewhere out there in the darkness, moving slowly along the river, its occupant unseen. That last thought lingers longer than the others, because rivers were not empty, even at night. Trade, travel, and survival didn't always wait for sunrise. There were moments, urgent ones, when people moved under the cover of darkness. Fur traders navigating unfamiliar routes, messengers carrying information between settlements, indigenous travelers who knew these waterways intimately, able to read them in ways others could not. If someone were out there now, you wouldn't necessarily see them. You might only hear fragments, a faint dip of a paddle, a slight shift in the current, a sound like that hollow knock, repeating at uneven intervals. You listen again. Nothing, only the slow, steady breath of the river and the soft crackle of your fire. It's possible the sound was nothing more than wood against water, but the uncertainty remains. You shift your attention to the mist again. It has thickened further, now rising slightly higher above the surface. In places, it curls upward in thin strands, almost like smoke. It moves slowly, guided by currents of air too subtle to feel directly. Where it drifts closer to shore, it begins to touch the land itself, brushing against roots, stones, and the edges of your camp. This changes the space around you. The firelight, once clear and contained, now diffuses through the mist, softening its edges. Shadows lose their sharpness. Everything becomes slightly blurred, as if the world has been wrapped in a thin veil. This was one of the more disorienting aspects of river nights. Not just darkness, but distortion. Distances became harder to judge. Shapes lost definition. Movement, when it occurred, felt slower, more uncertain. Even familiar surroundings could feel altered, unfamiliar, as if you had been quietly moved somewhere else without realizing it. You glance toward the tree line again. At first, nothing stands out. Then a shape, not moving exactly, but different from what you remember. Slightly darker than the shadows around it. Taller, perhaps. You focus on it, trying to determine its edges, its form. A tree, most likely. But the longer you look, the less certain you become. This is how the mind works in low visibility. It searches for patterns, for meaning. It tries to turn incomplete information into something recognizable. And sometimes it succeeds. Other times, it creates something that isn't really there at all. You blink, shift your gaze, then look back. The shape hasn't changed, which in its own way is reassuring. If it were moving, if it were approaching, you would notice. Stillness, even when it's unclear, is easier to accept. A soft breeze moves through the area. You feel it lightly against your face, barely enough to disturb the air. But it's enough to affect the mist. The thin layers begin to shift, opening small gaps here and there, briefly revealing patches of dark water beneath before closing again. In one of those gaps, you catch a glimpse. A ripple, broad, slow, not like the quick disturbance of a fish or a small animal. This one spreads outward in a wide arc, as if something beneath the surface has moved with purpose. The gap closes before you can see more. But now you know there is something out there, not necessarily near, not necessarily a threat, but present. You sit a little straighter. Your awareness sharpens again, pulling you slightly out of that slow, drifting state the night had been guiding you toward. Fatigue remains, but it's pushed back, held at a distance by the simple fact that something has changed. This was a common experience for those who spent nights near early American rivers, long stretches of quiet, broken by brief moments of heightened attention, not constant danger, but enough uncertainty to keep the mind engaged, enough movement to prevent complete rest. You reach toward the fire, adjusting one of the logs. It shifts, sending a small burst of sparks upward. For a moment, the light grows stronger, pushing the shadows back a little farther, illuminating the immediate area with renewed clarity. The ground, your belongings, the nearest edge of the bank. But beyond that, nothing changes. The river remains hidden behind the mist. The tree line stays dark and indistinct, and whatever caused that ripple remains unseen. You pull your hand back, letting the fire settle again. It returns to its steady glow, less intense, but more consistent. The warmth reaches you, faint but welcome, contrasting with the cool dampness that continues to build in the air. Somewhere in the distance, an animal calls. It's a low sound, stretched out, echoing faintly through the trees. Not loud enough to startle, but clear enough to notice. It repeats once, then fades. This, too, was part of the nighttime landscape. Communication, not between humans, but between the creatures that moved through this environment as their home. Calls, responses, signals carried across distance, each one meaningful in ways you might not fully understand. You listen, half expecting a reply. None comes. The silence that follows feels slightly heavier than before. Not empty, just paused, as if something has shifted in the rhythm of the night. You adjust your position again, feeling the stiffness in your legs, the slow ache that comes from remaining still too long. The ground is less forgiving now, its earlier neutrality replaced by a dull pressure that reminds you of your own physical limits. This is another thing the night reveals. Not just the environment, but yourself within it. Your awareness of your body becomes sharper. Every sensation, cold, pressure, fatigue feels more noticeable when there are fewer distractions. During the day, movement and activity occupy your attention. At night, especially in a place like this, there is space to notice everything, even the smallest discomfort, even the faintest sound, even the quiet, persistent movement of a river you can barely see. You glance once more toward the water. The mist shifts again, briefly thinning. This time, the surface appears smoother than before. The earlier ripple is gone, replaced by a more uniform stillness. The current continues beneath, of course, but from this angle, at this moment, it looks almost calm. Almost, because there's always that subtle motion, that constant, underlying movement that never fully disappears. And that's what defines it. The river doesn't stop at night. It doesn't slow for darkness or pause for rest. It continues with the same quiet persistence, whether you're watching it or not, whether you understand it or not. That realization settles in slowly, and with it, a certain kind of acceptance. You are here for now. The river is here always, and the night, vast and patient, stretches on around both of you, holding its silence, its sounds, its shifting layers of uncertainty. Eventually, your focus softens again. The heightened alertness fades, not completely, but enough to let your thoughts drift slightly. The patterns return, the steady flow of water, the occasional rustle, the soft crackle of fire. Nothing demands immediate action. Nothing forces a decision. And so you remain where you are, listening, waiting, existing within that narrow space of light and warmth, surrounded by a world that continues just beyond your reach. This was the reality of early American rivers at night. Not a single story, but a collection of moments like these. Quiet, uncertain, endlessly unfolding, and always, just beyond the edge of what you can see, something more. At some point, without any clear signal, the night reaches its deepest state. It's not something you see happen. It's something you realize after it has already settled in. The air feels cooler, the sounds feel farther apart, and the darkness, already thick, seems to have gained another layer, as if the world has quietly folded in on itself. You notice it in the fire first. The flames have lowered again, reduced to a steady, quiet burn. The wood has shifted inward, forming a bed of glowing embers, with only the occasional flicker rising above them. The light they cast is softer now, more contained, barely reaching the edge of the riverbank. Beyond that edge, everything disappears. The mist has spread farther onto land, wrapping around the base of trees and drifting low across the ground. It moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to remind you that nothing here is ever truly still. You draw a breath. The air feels heavier than before, cool, damp, carrying the faint scent of water and earth. It fills your lungs more slowly, as if even breathing has adjusted to the rhythm of the night. For a while, nothing changes. The river continues its steady flow. The occasional sound breaks through, a distant rustle, a faint splash, but they come less frequently now, spaced out, as if whatever moves through this landscape has settled into its own patterns. This is the hour when fatigue becomes something more than a background presence. It settles deeper. Your thoughts begin to stretch, slowing at the edges. Focus becomes something you have to maintain rather than something that comes naturally. The fire's glow becomes almost hypnotic, its steady warmth inviting you to close your eyes, if only for a moment. And that's where the tension lies. Because near a river like this, in a place like this, complete rest is a decision, not an easy one. Early travelers often spoke, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, about this balance. The need to sleep weighed against the need to remain aware. Some took turns keeping watch. Others relied on instinct, on the hope that any significant disturbance would be enough to wake them. But here alone, that decision feels different. You shift slightly, adjusting your position once more. The ground feels harder now. The dampness has worked its way deeper, making the earth less forgiving. Your muscles carry a quiet stiffness, the result of hours spent in stillness. Even small movements feel deliberate, measured. You glance toward the river again. Nothing, or rather, nothing obvious. The mist has thickened to the point where the surface is almost entirely hidden. Only the faintest suggestion of movement remains, a subtle shifting within the gray, like something breathing beneath a thin veil. Then, without warning, a sound, not a splash this time, a glide, soft, continuous, moving from one point to another, just beyond your view. It's different from everything you've heard before tonight. Smoother, more deliberate, as if something is traveling along the surface rather than breaking through it. You remain still. Every part of your attention focuses on that sound. It continues for a moment, then slows, then stops. No follow-up, no clear conclusion, just the return of silence. Your mind begins to work through possibilities again. A large animal entering the water and moving along the edge. A submerged log shifting with the current. Something swimming just beneath the surface, close enough to disturb the water, but not enough to break it. Or something else entirely. This is the part that early accounts often leave open, not because they were hiding something, but because they didn't always know. The wilderness at night didn't provide clear answers. It offered impressions, fragments, pieces of information that had to be interpreted, and sometimes those interpretations remained uncertain. You listen longer. Nothing returns. The sound, whatever it was, has passed, but it leaves something behind. A heightened awareness, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, the environment is active, layered, alive in ways that aren't always visible. You shift your gaze toward the fire again. The embers glow steadily, their light pulsing faintly as small pockets of heat shift within them. Occasionally, a thin flame rises, flickers, and disappears, as if testing the air before retreating again. You consider adding more wood, but the thought lingers without action, because doing so would mean movement, noise, disruption. And right now, the stillness feels important, something to maintain rather than break. This, too, reflects the habits of those who lived through these experiences. At night, especially near rivers, unnecessary movement was often avoided, not out of fear alone, but out of practicality. Quiet allowed you to hear more, to detect changes, to remain aware of your surroundings. And awareness, in a place like this, was a kind of protection. You glance toward the tree line once more. The shapes there remain unchanged, dark, uneven, blending into one another. The earlier form you noticed is still there, or something like it, fixed in place, offering no new information. It has become part of the landscape now, no longer drawing your focus the way it did before. This is how the mind adapts. What once seemed uncertain becomes familiar, not because it has changed, but because you have adjusted to it. Another subtle shift passes through the air, not wind exactly, more like a change in pressure, a quiet movement that you feel more than hear. The mist responds, drifting slightly, opening a narrow gap over the river's surface. For a brief moment, you see it again. The water, dark, slow, reflecting almost nothing. And then, a shape, low, elongated, moving just beneath the surface. It's there for only a second, maybe less. A distortion in the water, a line that doesn't match the natural flow of the current. It glides forward, steady and controlled, then disappears as the mist closes in again. You don't react immediately, because reaction would require certainty, and what you saw might not have been enough, but the impression remains, clearer than anything earlier in the night. Something was there, something moving with purpose. You feel your breath slow slightly, not from fear, but from focus. This is the closest the river has come to revealing itself since the sun went down. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to confirm what you already suspected. The river is not empty. It never was. You remain still for a long moment, listening, waiting, but nothing follows. No second movement, no repeated sound, just the steady, unbroken flow. Eventually, the tension eases, not disappearing, but settling back into that low, constant awareness that has defined the entire night. Your thoughts begin to slow again, drifting back toward that quiet, in-between state where rest and alertness overlap. The fire dims slightly, the mist thickens once more, and the river returns to its familiar pattern, present, active, but hidden. Time continues to pass, slowly, almost unnoticed. This is the hour when the night feels longest, when the distance between now and morning seems stretched, uncertain. There's no visible change to mark progress, no clear signal that time is moving forward. Only subtle shifts, the cooling air, the gradual fading of certain sounds, the deepening of that quiet, persistent stillness. You adjust your posture again, leaning slightly, feeling the weight of your own body pressing against the ground. Fatigue is stronger now, not overwhelming, but steady. Your eyes linger on the fire, watching the embers glow and fade, each cycle slower than the last. The rhythm is almost enough to pull you into sleep. Almost, but the river remains, even unseen, even unheard at times. It holds your attention in a way that prevents complete rest, because somewhere beneath that surface, within that moving darkness, something continues to exist, to move, to pass through this space without revealing itself fully. And that knowledge, quiet as it is, keeps you here, half awake, half watching, sharing the night with a river that does not sleep. It's difficult to say exactly when the night begins to shift again. There's no sudden change, no clear dividing line. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to ease. Not the darkness itself, it still surrounds you completely, but the feeling of its weight starts to thin, just enough for you to notice. You remain where you are, near the fatting warmth of the fire. The embers have settled lower now, their glow softer, less insistent. They no longer command your attention the way they once did. Instead, they exist quietly at the edge of your awareness, a steady presence rather than a focal point. The river, too, has changed, not in sound exactly, but in rhythm. The pauses between disturbances feel longer now. The occasional splashes that once broke the silence have grown less frequent. Whatever moved through the water earlier in the night has either passed on or settled into stillness. You listen carefully. For a while, there is nothing new, just the steady flow, the faint movement of mist drifting over the surface, the distant, almost forgotten rustle of leaves somewhere beyond the tree line. And then, gradually, another sound begins to emerge. It's subtle, so subtle that at first you mistake it for something internal, something imagined. But as you continue to listen, it becomes clearer. Birds, not many, not loud, just one or two, calling softly from somewhere high in the trees. The sounds are short, tentative, as if testing the air rather than claiming it. They don't carry far, but they don't need to. Their presence alone signals something important. The night is beginning to loosen its hold. You don't see it yet. The sky remains dark, the stars still visible overhead. The mist still clings to the river, though it has begun to thin in places, breaking apart into smaller, drifting patches. But the atmosphere has shifted in a way that's difficult to describe. It feels less enclosed, less absolute. This was one of the quiet transitions early travelers would have come to recognize, not through sight, but through sound and sensation. The gradual return of certain birds, the slight change in air movement, the way the darkness, though still present, no longer felt as complete. You shift slightly, stretching your legs. The stiffness is more noticeable now, the result of hours spent in stillness. Your body responds slowly, joints reluctant at first, then gradually loosening as you adjust your position. The ground beneath you feels firmer than before, as if the dampness has settled rather than spread. You glance toward the river again. The mist parts briefly, revealing a wider stretch of water than you've seen all night. It's still dark, but not as impenetrable. There's a faint difference now, a subtle lightening, not enough to illuminate, but enough to separate the surface from the sky. The river is no longer just a void. It has form again, even if only slightly. And with that, your perception shifts. The same water that felt unknowable hours ago now begins to return to something more familiar. Still unpredictable, still active, but less hidden. Another bird calls, this one a little louder, a little more confident. It's answered faintly from farther down the tree line. The sounds don't fill the space yet. They don't replace the quiet, but they begin to layer over it, adding texture where there was once only stillness. You take a slow breath. The air feels different. Still cool, still damp, but lighter somehow. Easier to draw in. The heaviness that settled during the deepest part of the night has begun to lift, even if only slightly. Behind you, the fire shifts. A small piece of wood collapses inward, sending a brief flicker of flame upward before settling back into embers. The light reaches out again for a moment, touching the edges of the mist, revealing its movement more clearly. It curls and drifts, thinner now, less uniform. Soon it will disappear entirely. But not yet. You return your attention to the river. There's a sound, soft, measured. You recognize it immediately this time. A paddle, dip, a pause, pull, then again, dip, pull. The rhythm is unmistakable. Somewhere out there, beyond the thinning mist, someone is moving along the river. Not quickly, not carelessly, but with the kind of steady, practiced motion that suggests familiarity with these waters. You don't see them, not yet, but the sound carries clearly now, no longer distorted in the same way it was earlier in the night. The changing air has altered how it travels, making it easier to place, easier to understand. They're not close, but they're not far either. You remain still, listening. The pattern continues, each stroke consistent, unhurried. Whoever it is, they are not searching. They are not lost. They know where they're going, even in this fatting darkness. This, too, was part of the reality of early American rivers. Not just isolation, but connection. Even at night, even in uncertainty, these waterways linked people together. Travelers moved along them quietly, efficiently, often unseen by others who shared the same space. For a moment, you consider calling out, but the thought fades quickly, because there's no need, and because silence here feels more natural than interruption. The sound continues for a while longer. Then slowly, gradually, it begins to fade. The rhythm grows softer, more distant, until it blends back into the general flow of the river and disappears entirely. You never see them, but you know they were there, and somehow that feels enough. The sky shifts again. This time, you notice it more clearly. The darkness has lightened, not dramatically, but enough to soften the contrast between the treetops and the sky above them. The stars, once sharp and numerous, begin to lose their intensity, fading one by one as the first hints of dawn approach. The river reflects this change. Where it was once an indistinct shadow, it now carries faint traces of the sky's gradual transformation. The surface is still dark, but not uniformly so. Subtle variations begin to appear, slight differences in tone that hint at depth, movement, direction. You can see it now, not fully, but enough. The earlier tension, the constant need to interpret, to guess, to imagine begins to ease. The environment hasn't become safe, exactly, but it has become readable again, and that makes all the difference. Another bird calls, then another. The sounds build slowly, not all at once, but steadily, layering over one another in a way that feels natural, expected. The silence of the night doesn't vanish, it recedes, making space for something new. The mist continues to thin, breaking apart into smaller strands before dissolving into the air. The river, once hidden, reveals more of itself with each passing moment. The banks become clearer. The trees regain their shape. The water, though still moving as it always has, no longer feels unknowable. You shift your weight forward slightly, looking out across the surface. For the first time since night fell, you can follow the current with your eyes. You can see how it bends, how it carries small fragments along its path. You can begin to understand it again, not just as a presence, but as a place. This is what daylight returns, not just visibility, but comprehension. The night did not change the river. It changed your ability to perceive it. And now, as that ability returns, so does a certain kind of calm. Not complete comfort, but something close. The fire behind you has nearly burned out now, reduced to a faint glow, with only occasional flickers remaining. It no longer serves the same purpose it did before. The light it offers is no longer necessary. The world is providing its own. You take another breath. The air feels clearer, cool but not heavy, fresh in a way that signals the beginning of something, rather than the depth of something already settled. The night is ending, not abruptly, but with the same slow, deliberate pace it used to arrive. And as you sit there, watching the river emerge from darkness into something visible once more, you begin to understand why so many chose to wait for this moment before continuing their journey. Because now, the unknown has edges again. The unseen has become seen, and the river, still vast, still powerful, still indifferent, has returned to a form you can finally follow. The current moves steadily forward, and soon you will too. You don't stand up right away, even though the light is returning, even though the shapes of the land have begun to settle back into something recognizable. There's a quiet hesitation that keeps you where you are. It's not uncertainty anymore. It's something closer to reflection. The river, now partially revealed, feels different in a way that's difficult to fully explain. Just hours ago, it was something you could not read, a presence defined by sound and suggestion, by movement hidden beneath darkness and mist. Now, as the early light spreads slowly across its surface, it becomes something else entirely, structured, directional, almost familiar again. You can see the current now, not clearly enough to trace every detail, but enough to understand its path. The subtle bends, the way the water gathers speed in certain places, then eases in others. Small fragments, leaves, twigs drift along its surface, marking its motion in a way that was impossible to observe during the night. The mist has nearly disappeared. What remains is thin and scattered, lingering in low pockets along the water's edge, dissolving as the air continues to shift. The banks, once hidden, now take shape again, uneven, textured, marked by roots and stones, and patches of damp earth that reflect the faint light of dawn. You shift your hands against the ground and begin to rise. Your body responds slowly. The stiffness is more pronounced now, your muscles reluctant at first after hours of stillness. There's a dull ache in your legs, a quiet reminder of how long you've remained in one place. You straighten gradually, letting your balance settle before taking a step forward. The ground feels firmer than it did in the night, cool, but no longer as damp. The subtle changes in temperature have altered the surface just enough to make it more stable beneath your feet. You move closer to the river's edge, stopping just short of where the soil begins to soften. From here, you can see more. The surface of the water stretches outward dark, but no longer impenetrable. The faint light from the sky reflects unevenly, broken by the constant motion of the current. It's not calm, but it's understandable, and that makes it feel smaller somehow. Not in size, but in mystery. You look downstream. The path of the river disappears into the distance, curving gently out of view. During the night, that direction held nothing but uncertainty. Now, it suggests movement, travel, a continuation. Upstream, it's the same. The water flows from a place you cannot see, carrying with it whatever lies beyond your current understanding. But in daylight, that unknown feels different, less immediate, less pressing. You hear movement behind you, a bird landing somewhere in the branches above. It shifts its weight, then settles. A second bird calls from farther away, its voice clearer now, more defined in the morning air. The sounds of the environment are returning, not suddenly, but steadily. Insects begin to stir again, their faint hum building slowly in the background. Leaves rustle as a light breeze moves through the trees. The stillness of the night gives way to a more layered kind of quiet, one filled with small, continuous activity. You glance back at the remains of your fire. Only embers now, a soft, fatting glow with no real heat left to offer. The purpose it served through the night has passed. It kept you grounded, gave you a point of focus when everything else was uncertain. But now, it's no longer needed. You step away from it. Your attention returns fully to the river. There are marks along the bank you didn't notice before. Small impressions in the damp soil. Tracks. Some are shallow, barely visible. Others more distinct patterns pressed into the earth by something that passed through during the night. You crouch slightly, looking closer. They overlap in places, crossing paths, leading toward the water, then away again. Animals, most likely, moving in and out under cover of darkness, following their own routines, their own instincts. The river served them just as it served you, though in very different ways. One set of tracks stands out more than the others. Larger, heavier, the edges are slightly softened, as if they were made some time ago, perhaps earlier in the night. They lead down toward the water's edge, then disappear where the soil becomes too wet to hold their shape. You don't follow them. You don't need to. Their presence alone is enough to confirm what the night only suggested. You were not alone here. Not at any point. You straighten again, letting your gaze move across the wider landscape. The light has grown stronger, though the sun itself has not yet fully risen above the horizon. The sky carries a pale, muted tone, spreading evenly across the scene. Colors begin to return, subtle at first, then more defined. The green of the trees, the brown of the earth, the dark, shifting surface of the river. Everything feels more grounded now, more stable, and yet the memory of the night lingers, not as fear, but as awareness. You understand this place differently now than you did before the sun set. You've experienced it in a state where sight was limited, where sound carried more meaning, where every small change mattered. And that understanding doesn't disappear with the light. It stays with you. You take a step along the bank, then another. The movement feels natural again. Your body adjusts quickly, finding its rhythm after the long stillness. The stiffness begins to ease, replaced by a steady, purposeful motion. If you were to continue along the river now, the experience would be entirely different from what it would have been at night. You would see obstacles before reaching them. You would read the current, choose your path with confidence. You would understand where the water deepens, where it narrows, where it turns. This is why so many early travelers waited, not because the river changed, but because their relationship to it did. You pause once more, looking out across the water. For a brief moment, everything feels quiet again, not the heavy, uncertain quiet of the night, but a lighter, more open stillness. The kind that exists between moments, before the full activity of the day begins. And in that moment, you realize something. The river at night wasn't a different place. It was the same place, experienced differently. The sounds, the movements, the unseen presence beneath the surface, they're still there now. The creatures that moved in darkness have not vanished. The current has not changed its path. Only your ability to perceive it has shifted. That's what made early American rivers at night so distinct. Not just the danger, not just the uncertainty, but the transformation of understanding. You turn slightly, preparing to move on. The path ahead follows the river's edge, curving gently through the landscape. It's clearer now, easier to navigate. The unknown stretches ahead, but it no longer feels immediate or overwhelming. Behind you, the last traces of the night fade completely. The embers of the fire cool, the mist disappears, and the river, steady and unbroken, continues its course through the waking world. You take another step forward, then another, and just like that, the long night by the river becomes something that has passed, something observed, experienced, and now carried with you as you move on. But the river remains, flowing, constant, waiting for the next traveler who will sit at its edge when the light fades and discover it all over again. The morning does not rush you. It unfolds at its own pace, just as the night did, only now. Everything feels more open, more readable, less confined by uncertainty. You continue along the riverbank, your steps slow at first, then gradually settling into a steady rhythm. The ground is uneven, but manageable. Roots push up through the soil in places, forming natural obstacles that you step over without much thought. Patches of damp earth still cling near the edge of the water, darker in color, softer underfoot. You adjust instinctively, choosing firmer ground where you can, avoiding the areas that might give way beneath your weight. The river stays close beside you. Now that you can see it more clearly, its movement feels less mysterious, though no less powerful. The current pulls steadily, carrying debris along its path, small branches, leaves, the occasional larger fragment that drifts slowly past before disappearing around a bend. You notice details you couldn't before. Subtle variations in the water's surface, places where it dips slightly, where it gathers and accelerates, where something beneath alters its flow. Rocks, partially submerged, break the current into soft ripples. Fallen logs extend from the bank, their surfaces worn smooth by time and water. These are the features that would have been hidden from you in the dark. Now they define the river, and they remind you just how much was there all along, unnoticed. You walk a little farther. The trees begin to thin slightly, allowing more light to filter through. The forest is still dense, but not as closed in as it felt during the night. The sky above grows brighter, shifting from pale gray to something warmer, hinting at the sun just beyond the horizon. Birdsong increases. What started as a few scattered calls has become a layered chorus, different tones overlapping, echoing lightly through the trees. It's not overwhelming, but it fills the space in a way that changes how the environment feels. Alive, active, the stillness of the night has been replaced by motion, not frantic, not chaotic, but constant. You pause briefly, looking out across the river again. From this angle, you can see farther downstream. The bend is more pronounced here, the water curving around a cluster of rocks that break the surface in uneven shapes. The current moves faster in that section, narrowing slightly before widening again beyond your view. It's easy to imagine how different this would have been in darkness, how that bend, hidden from sight, could have altered the course of a boat without warning. How the sound of faster moving water might have reached you too late to react. You continue walking. Your body feels better now. The stiffness has eased, replaced by a steady energy that comes with movement. The cool air, once heavy with dampness, now feels refreshing. Each breath comes easier, filling your lungs without resistance. You pass another section of bank, where the ground slopes more steeply toward the water. Here the soil is softer, marked again by tracks. Fresh ones this time, smaller than before, delicate impressions that suggest lighter animals, perhaps something that came to drink in the early hours before the light fully returned. The edges are sharper, less worn by time or moisture. You crouch slightly, observing them. They lead down to the water, pause there, then turn back toward the trees. A simple pattern, one that likely repeats itself every day, unnoticed by most. This is another layer of the river's life, not hidden, just overlooked. At night, those movements were sounds, rustles, splashes, faint disturbances in the dark. Now, they are visible, traceable, part of a larger pattern you can begin to understand. You stand again and move on. The path becomes slightly clearer as you go, shaped by repeated use. Not a road, not even a formal trail, but a natural route formed by those who have passed this way before, human or otherwise. It follows the river closely, rarely straying far. This was common. Early travelers often stayed near the water, not just for direction, but for necessity. The river provided guidance in a landscape that might otherwise feel endless. It offered resources, orientation, and a sense of continuity. Even when it felt uncertain, it was still something to follow. You step over a fallen branch and continue forward. The sound of the river shifts slightly as you approach the bend you saw earlier. The current grows louder, not dramatically, but enough to signal the change in its movement. Water pressing against stone, redirecting itself, creating small, consistent patterns of sound. You reach the edge of that bend and stop. From here, you can see the rocks more clearly. Dark, worn surfaces rising just above the waterline. The current splits around them, forming narrow channels where the water moves more quickly. Small waves form and collapse, repeating in a steady, predictable rhythm. It's not dangerous, exactly, but it demands attention. In daylight, it's manageable. At night, it would have been something else entirely. You watch the flow for a moment, tracing its path with your eyes. Understanding it now feels almost natural. as if your mind is filling in the gaps left by the night's uncertainty. Then something catches your attention. Movement on the opposite bank. You narrow your focus, looking more carefully. At first, it's just a shape among the trees. Then it shifts. A deer. It stands partially hidden by the underbrush, its body still, its head raised slightly as it watches the river. Its ears flick once, then again, responding to sounds you can't hear. It doesn't seem alarmed, just aware. For a moment, you both remain where you are, separated by the water, connected by the same quiet observation. Then, without urgency, it turns and moves back into the trees, disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. The space it occupied feels empty for a moment, then normal again. You take a breath and continue walking. Encounters like that were part of the experience, brief, quiet, often without consequence. They didn't define the journey, but they added to it, small reminders of the life that shared this space. The river curves again ahead. The light continues to grow. The sky now carrying hints of color, soft golds, and pale blues beginning to replace the gray. The sun is close now, though still hidden behind the horizon. You feel it before you see it. A subtle warmth in the air, a shift in the way light touches the landscape. The night is fully gone, and yet it doesn't feel distant. It lingers in your memory, in the way you now notice details you might have ignored before. The way you listen, even in daylight, for changes in sound. The way you observe the water, not just as a surface, but as something with depth, movement, and hidden layers. This is what remains, not the darkness itself, but the understanding it brought. You slow your pace slightly, letting your steps match the rhythm of the river once more. It moves as it always has, unchanged by your presence, unchanged by the passing of night into day. And as you follow its course, you realize that this journey isn't just about moving forward. It's about learning to see the same place in different ways, because eventually the light will fade again, and when it does, the river will return to that other form, quieter, less visible, more uncertain. But next time, you'll know it differently, not completely, never completely, but enough to understand that what happens in the dark isn't separate from what you see in the light. It's simply another layer of the same endless flow. It unfolds at its own pace, just as the night did, only now. Everything feels more open, more readable, less confined by uncertainty. You continue along the riverbank, your steps slow at first, then gradually settling into a steady rhythm. The ground is uneven, but manageable. Roots push up through the soil in places, forming natural obstacles that you step over without much thought. Patches of damp earth still cling near the edge of the water, darker in color, softer underfoot. You adjust instinctively, choosing firmer ground where you can, avoiding the areas that might give way beneath your weight. The river stays close beside you, now that you can see it more clearly, its movement feels less mysterious, though no less powerful. The current pulls steadily, carrying debris along its path, small branches, leaves, the occasional larger fragment that drifts slowly past before disappearing around a bend. You notice details you couldn't before, subtle variations in the water's surface, places where it dips slightly, where it gathers and accelerates, where something beneath alters its flow. Rocks, partially submerged, break the current into soft ripples. Fallen logs extend from the bank, their surfaces worn smooth by time and water. These are the features that would have been hidden from you in the dark. Now they define the river, and they remind you just how much was there all along, unnoticed. You walk a little farther. The trees begin to thin slightly, allowing more light to filter through. The forest is still dense, but not as closed in as it felt during the night. The sky above grows brighter, shifting from pale gray to something warmer, hinting at the sun just beyond the horizon. Birdsong increases. What started as a few scattered calls has become a layered chorus, different tones overlapping, echoing lightly through the trees. It's not overwhelming, but it fills the space in a way that changes how the environment feels. Alive, active, the stillness of the night has been replaced by motion, not frantic, not chaotic, but constant. You pause briefly, looking out across the river again. From this angle, you can see farther downstream. The bend is more pronounced here, the water curving around a cluster of rocks that break the surface in uneven shapes. The current moves faster in that section, narrowing slightly before widening again beyond your view. It's easy to imagine how different this would have been in darkness, how that bend, hidden from sight, could have altered the course of a boat without warning. How the sound of faster moving water might have reached you too late to react. You continue walking. Your body feels better now. The stiffness has eased, replaced by a steady energy that comes with movement. The cool air, once heavy with dampness, now feels refreshing. Each breath comes easier, filling your lungs without resistance. You pass another section of bank, where the ground slopes more steeply toward the water. Here, the soil is softer, marked again by tracks. Fresh ones this time, smaller than before, delicate impressions that suggest lighter animals, perhaps something that came to drink in the early hours before the light fully returned. The edges are sharper, less worn by time or moisture. You crouch slightly, observing them. They lead down to the water, pause there, then turn back toward the trees. A simple pattern, one that likely repeats itself every day, unnoticed by most. This is another layer of the river's life, not hidden, just overlooked. At night, those movements were sounds, rustles, splashes, faint disturbances in the dark. Now, they are visible, traceable, part of a larger pattern you can begin to understand. You stand again and move on. The path becomes slightly clearer as you go, shaped by repeated use. Not a road, not even a formal trail, but a natural route formed by those who have passed this way before, human or otherwise. It follows the river closely, rarely straying far. This was common. Early travelers often stayed near the water, not just for direction, but for necessity. The river provided guidance in a landscape that might otherwise feel endless. It offered resources, orientation, and a sense of continuity. Even when it felt uncertain, it was still something to follow. You step over a fallen branch and continue forward. The sound of the river shifts slightly as you approach the bend you saw earlier. The current grows louder, not dramatically, but enough to signal the change in its movement. Water pressing against stone, redirecting itself, creating small, consistent patterns of sound. You reach the edge of that bend and stop. From here, you can see the rocks more clearly. Dark, worn surfaces rising just above the waterline. The current splits around them, forming narrow channels where the water moves more quickly. Small waves form and collapse, repeating in a steady, predictable rhythm. It's not dangerous, exactly, but it demands attention. In daylight, it's manageable. At night, it would have been something else entirely. You watch the flow for a moment, tracing its path with your eyes. Understanding it now feels almost natural, as if your mind is filling in the gaps left by the night's uncertainty. Then something catches your attention. Movement on the opposite bank. You narrow your focus, looking more carefully. At first, it's just a shape among the trees. Then it shifts. A deer. It stands partially hidden by the underbrush, its body still, its head raised slightly as it watches the river. Its ears flick once, then again, responding to sounds you can't hear. It doesn't seem alarmed, just aware. For a moment, you both remain where you are, separated by the water, connected by the same quiet observation. Then, without urgency, it turns and moves back into the trees, disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. The space it occupied feels empty for a moment, then normal again. You take a breath and continue walking. Encounters like that were part of the experience, brief, quiet, often without consequence. They didn't define the journey, but they added to it, small reminders of the life that shared this space. The river curves again ahead. The light continues to grow. The sky now carrying hints of color, soft golds, and pale blues beginning to replace the gray. The sun is close now, though still hidden behind the horizon. You feel it before you see it. A subtle warmth in the air, a shift in the way light touches the landscape. The night is fully gone, and yet it doesn't feel distant. It lingers in your memory, in the way you now notice details you might have ignored before. The way you listen, even in daylight, for changes in sound. The way you observe the water, not just as a surface, but as something with depth, movement, and hidden layers. This is what remains, not the darkness itself, but the understanding it brought. You slow your pace slightly, letting your steps match the rhythm of the river once more. It moves as it always has, unchanged by your presence, unchanged by the passing of night into day. And as you follow its course, you realize that this journey isn't just about moving forward. It's about learning to see the same place in different ways, because eventually the light will fade again, and when it does, the river will return to that other form, quieter, less visible, more uncertain. But next time, you'll know it differently, not completely, never completely, but enough to understand that what happens in the dark isn't separate from what you see in the light. It's simply another layer of the same endless flow. Next, continue. The sun finally breaks the horizon fully, and with it, the river changes once more, not in movement, but in feeling. Light spreads across the water in slow waves, turning the surface from a dull, shadowed path into something textured and alive with reflection. The current glints now, not constantly, but in scattered flashes as the angle of light shifts through the trees. What once felt like a hidden force is now fully exposed, yet somehow still vast enough to feel humbling. You keep walking along the bank. The morning is now firmly established. Birds are no longer hesitant. Their calls overlap freely, weaving through the forest in layered patterns. Insects rise again into the air, forming faint drifting clouds near the vegetation. The entire environment feels like it is reassembling itself after the long absence of light. And yet, despite all this clarity, your attention still returns to the water, because now you can compare. You remember how it sounded in darkness, how every ripple felt amplified, how every splash seemed significant, how the mist erased distance and turned simple motion into uncertainty. Now, those same sounds exist, but they are smaller, more contained, easier to interpret. A fish breaks the surface. You see it clearly this time, just a quick flash of movement before the water settles again. Nothing mysterious about it now, just life continuing beneath and above the surface. But last night, that same movement would have meant something else in your mind. You continue forward. The riverbank becomes slightly wider here, opening into a flatter stretch of land. Grass grows thicker, and the soil looks less disturbed. This area feels more stable, more frequently used. You notice faint signs of human passage, flattened patches of vegetation, older footprints partially reclaimed by nature. This wasn't just wilderness. It was a route, a corridor that people and animals both relied on, each in their own way, moving through the same landscape without ever fully dominating it. You pause near a bend where the river slows slightly. The water here is calmer, less forcefully directed than the section you passed earlier. It spreads wider, forming shallow edges where sunlight reaches deeper into the surface. Small stones beneath the water become visible, distorted, but clearly present. You crouch briefly at the edge. Your reflection appears in the river, broken by ripples, shifting with every small movement. It's not stable, not fixed. Even your own image is subject to the river's constant motion. It reminds you of something subtle but important. Nothing here is still. Even what looks calm is always changing. You straighten again and continue. As you walk, your thoughts drift back not to fear, but to contrast. Night and day along this river are not opposites. They are versions of the same reality filtered through different limits of perception. At night, you heard more than you saw. You inferred, imagined, reconstructed. In daylight, you see more, but you may begin to overlook the subtle sounds that still carry meaning. Both are incomplete on their own. Together, they form something closer to understanding. A few more steps bring you to a small clearing where the riverbank rises slightly, giving you a wider view of the water's path ahead. From here, you can see how it bends again in the distance, disappearing behind clusters of trees and uneven terrain. The landscape is not flat or simple. It is layered, shaped by water over time, constantly adjusted by flow and erosion. You realize something else now. The river does not just move through the land. It builds it, slowly, indifferently, continuously. A sound behind you pulls your attention briefly. Footsteps not yours. You turn slightly. A traveler appears on the path behind you. Not close yet, but approaching at a steady pace. Dressed in practical, worn clothing suited for movement through rough terrain. A pack rests on their back, slightly uneven from use. They walk with the familiarity of someone who knows this route. For a moment, neither of you speaks. Just the shared recognition of presence in a space that, not long ago, felt entirely isolated. As they come closer, they slow slightly, acknowledging you with a small nod. No words yet, just the quiet understanding that rivers often bring people together in passing. When they finally reach your position, they glance toward the water. Quiet night, they ask simply. The question isn't casual in the way modern conversation might be. It carries weight, shared experience, an assumption that you would understand what quiet really means in a place like this. You look back at the river before answering. Yes, you say, quiet and not quiet. They give a faint, knowing exhale, almost a smile, but not quite. That sounds about right. And just like that, the night you experienced alone becomes something shared. Not identical, not fully understood by the other person, but recognized in fragments. Enough to acknowledge its reality. They shift their pack slightly, preparing to continue. River's calmer now, they add. But it always looks that way after dark. Then they continue down the path, following the same direction the river flows. You watch them go for a moment before turning your attention back to the water, because that final statement lingers. It always looks that way after dark, not because the river changes, but because perception does. You stand there for a while longer, letting the morning settle fully around you. The river moves forward without pause, as it always has. The land breathes quietly around it. Life continues in all directions, visible now, layered and active and familiar again. And somewhere beneath that clarity, you understand something more deeply than before. The night was never an interruption. It was part of the river's full identity, just one that only reveals itself when the light is gone. You stay near the bend a little longer after the traveler leaves. Their footsteps fade gradually into the same path you've been following, swallowed by distance and the soft rise of morning sound. Birdsong fills the gap almost immediately, as if the landscape refuses to leave any space empty for long. The river continues its steady movement, but your attention doesn't leave it. Not anymore, because now there's a kind of dual awareness forming in your mind, two versions of the same place overlapping. One you experienced in darkness, built from sound, uncertainty, and fragments of movement you could barely confirm. And another unfolding in daylight, structured, visible, easy to interpret. Neither replaces the other. They sit on top of each other, competing, completing. You begin walking again. The path is more defined here, shaped by repeated use. The soil is firmer, less wild. Grass bends under your steps and slowly springs back behind you. Small stones line sections of the bank, polished smooth by water and time. The river widens slightly as you move forward. Its surface now reflects more sky than forest. The sunlight grows stronger, warming the edges of the landscape in a way that wasn't possible just a short time ago. The transformation feels gradual but undeniable, like a veil lifting layer by layer. You notice more details now that weren't visible earlier. A shallow inlet where water slows and gathers sediment. A cluster of reeds bending with the current, their movement synchronized like breathing. A fallen tree extending partly into the river, shaping the flow around it in delicate, repeating patterns. Each of these would have existed last night, but they were invisible, not gone, just unreadable. You stop briefly near the fallen tree. It stretches from the bank into the water at an angle, its bark worn away in places where constant contact with the river has smoothed it down. The current splits around it, creating two distinct flows that rejoin a few meters downstream. Standing here, you can clearly see how it affects movement. Last night, if you had encountered this in darkness, it would have been something else entirely. A sudden obstruction, a change in sound, a place where water behaves differently without explanation until it's too late to understand why. Now it is simply structure. You continue. The forest on the far side of the river becomes more open as well. Sunlight reaches deeper between the trees, revealing layers of vegetation that were hidden before. The canopy is less dense here, allowing scattered beams of light to fall directly onto the forest floor. That same forest last night would have been nothing but a wall of shadow. You realize something quietly as you walk. The river does not become more or less dangerous depending on time. It only becomes more or less legible. That distinction matters more than anything else. A short distance ahead, you hear movement again, but this time it's unmistakably natural. A splash, followed by a second. You slow slightly, watching the water. A small group of fish breaks the surface near the shallow edge, chasing something unseen beneath the current. Their movement is quick, coordinated, and entirely ordinary in daylight. They scatter, regroup, disappear again beneath the surface. There is nothing mysterious about it now, but your mind still briefly recalls how that same kind of sound felt in the night. Heavier, less defined, more suggestive than explanatory. You keep walking. The river begins to straighten out, losing some of its earlier curves. The banks on either side become more consistent, less jagged. Trees align in looser formations, and the terrain feels less restrictive overall. You pass another faint set of tracks along the bank. These are older, partially erased by weather and time, but still visible enough to suggest repeated passage. Humans have been moving along this river for a long time, long enough for their presence to become part of its structure, even if not permanent. As you follow the path, your thoughts drift again to the night, not in fear, not in uncertainty, but in reconstruction. You start reassembling moments, not as isolated events, but as parts of a continuous system. The splash near the bank, the shifting sound of water that seemed to move closer, then farther, the shape in the mist that you couldn't fully identify, the distant paddle strokes that eventually faded into silence. Each one now fits into something more coherent, not necessarily explained, but contextualized. The river was never random. It was always active. Your perception simply lacked the resolution to interpret it fully. A breeze moves through the trees, stronger than before. It ripples across the surface of the river, breaking reflections into fragments of light. The sound of leaves increases slightly, layering over the steady flow of water. Ahead, the river bends once more, opening into a broader stretch. And as you approach it, you notice something new. A small structure, not large, not modern, just a simple wooden dock extending slightly into the water from the far bank. Weathered, old, functional. It suggests continued human use of this river travel, fishing, transport, passage. You slow your pace again, because now the river is no longer just wilderness. It is infrastructure, a path shared across time by countless others, each experiencing it differently depending on conditions, necessity, and perception. You reach a point directly across from the dock and stop. The water here is calmer, reflecting the sky in a more continuous sheet. You can see faint ripples moving outward from where the dock meets the river. Evidence of recent activity. Someone has been here. Not long ago. The realization doesn't feel alarming, just confirming the river is never isolated. Even in its quietest moments, it connects movement across distances. You stand there, letting the scene settle. The morning is now fully formed. Light is steady, sound is layered, and the world has regained its shape completely. And yet, the memory of the night remains vivid, not as something distant, but as something still connected to this exact place. Because now, you understand something more clearly than before. The river does not change between night and day. Only the story it tells you changes. And both versions are true. You take one last look across the water toward the dock, then resume walking along the bank, following the river as it continues forward, steady, unbroken, and endlessly unfolding. In every kind of light it passes through. You move past the dock without stopping, though its presence stays in your mind longer than expected, not because it is unusual, but because it confirms something you were already beginning to understand. This river is not remote in the way it might have felt at night. It is not untouched. It is part of a living network used, returned to, crossed, and relied upon again and again. The further you walk, the more that idea settles in. The wilderness here is not empty. It is occupied in layers, by animals, by travelers, by memory itself. The river carries all of it forward, without distinction. The path continues to follow the water closely. The terrain becomes slightly more uneven again, rising and falling in gentle slopes that mirror the river's own bends. You adjust your pace naturally, stepping over roots, avoiding softer patches of soil where footprints might sink too deeply. The sun is now fully present above the horizon, though still low enough to cast long, angled light across everything it touches. That angle changes your perception again. Shadows return, but in a different form than the night. They are sharper now, more defined, anchored to physical objects rather than drifting freely across unseen space. A tree is just a tree again. A rock is just a rock. Even the riverbank has structure you can trust. And yet, you notice something subtle. You are still listening more carefully than you would have before. Every shift in water, every rustle in the trees, every distant call that carries across the landscape. The night has not left your senses entirely. It has simply moved deeper into them, becoming part of how you interpret what you hear and see. Ahead, the river narrows slightly again, bending between two low ridges of land. The water speeds up here. You can see it clearly now, the surface tightening, stretching, pulling forward with more energy. Small waves form and break more frequently, creating a constant, visible motion that contrasts with the calmer sections you passed earlier. You slow as you approach it, not out of fear, but observation. This section of river would have sounded very different in darkness. You can almost reconstruct it now. The stronger rush of water, the deeper tone it would have carried, the way it might have masked or distorted other sounds nearby. You step closer to the edge. The bank here is slightly raised, giving you a better view of the channel ahead. The river cuts cleanly through the land, shaped by long periods of flow. On either side, vegetation leans toward the water, drawn by moisture and light. You notice movement again, this time not in the river, but above it. A bird glides low across the surface, skimming briefly before rising again toward the tree line. Its wings catch the light for a moment before it disappears into the canopy. Small moments like this feel different now. Not dramatic, just present. You continue walking along the bend. As you do, your thoughts drift again, not backward into fear or uncertainty, but into structure, into patterns. You begin to realize that what made the night feel so different was not just the absence of light, but the way information itself changed. During the day, the river gives you complete signals: shape, distance, movement, cause and effect. At night, those signals fragment. Sound becomes separated from source. Movement becomes suggestion instead of confirmation. Distance loses precision, and the mind fills in the gaps. Not incorrectly, but incompletely. You pass another set of faint marks in the soil. These are newer again, perhaps made earlier this morning. They follow the same direction as yours, confirming that others are moving along this path even now. You are not the only one reading this river, even in its daylight form. That realization feels grounding rather than unsettling, because it reinforces something important. This place is shared, not owned, not controlled, just used continuously, quietly, by many different lives, intersecting at different times. The river widens again ahead, and as it does, you begin to hear something new in the distance. Not water this time, not animals, voices, faint at first, then gradually clearer as you approach. A small gathering, likely near another crossing point or resting area along the river. You cannot see them yet, but the sound carries in fragments: conversation, movement, the occasional call to someone farther away. You slow slightly as you approach the area. The bank here opens into a broader stretch of land, flatter and more accessible. This is the kind of place where people naturally stop, where paths converge, where river travel becomes easier, where goods and people are exchanged. As you draw closer, figures begin to appear. Not many, just a small group near the water's edge. Some are handling supplies. Others are preparing to move on. There is a sense of routine in their actions, a familiarity with this place that suggests it is a regular stop rather than a destination. You do not interrupt immediately. Instead, you observe from a short distance, taking in the scene, and in doing so, something subtle shifts again in your understanding. The river is not just a natural force. It is not just a source of uncertainty at night or clarity in daylight. It is a meeting point, a continuous thread connecting people who may never fully see each other, yet still share the same water, the same path, the same shifting conditions of perception. Someone notices you eventually. A brief glance, then a nod. No question is asked. None is needed, because here, presence alone is enough to explain itself. You step closer, joining the edge of their movement, allowing yourself to become part of the flow of activity around the river. And for the first time since the night began, you are no longer observing the river alone. You are moving through it with others again, each of you carrying your own version of what this place is, shaped by timing, experience, and what you were able to see or not see. Behind you, upstream, the river continues exactly as it always has. Downstream, it continues the same way. And between those two directions, you stand in the present moment, where night has passed, day has fully arrived, and the same river quietly holds every version of itself at once. You step closer to the small gathering by the river's edge, not fully joining them yet, but close enough now that their presence becomes part of your immediate surroundings. The air here feels different, not because the river changes, but because people change how a place feels. Voices overlap in low conversation, not loud enough to dominate the space, but enough to reshape it. The steady rhythm of water is still there beneath everything, yet it no longer feels like the only voice in the landscape. Someone is tying rope around a bundle of goods. Another person is kneeling near the water, filling a container with slow, careful movements. A third stands slightly apart, watching the river with the same quiet attention you had earlier, except now it looks less like observation and more like routine. You notice something subtle as you watch them. Nobody seems rushed, even though they are clearly preparing to move or continue their journey. Everything is done with practiced calm. No hesitation, no confusion, just repetition of actions learned through experience along this exact kind of river environment. It makes you think again about the night, how different that same space must have felt when these same people, or others like them, were spread along it in darkness. How each of these simple tasks would have become more complex, more uncertain, more dependent on sound and memory than sight. You move a little closer, stopping near the edge of their activity. One of them glances at you briefly, not suspiciously, just acknowledging, then returns to what they were doing. You are no longer an outsider here, but not yet fully part of the group either. Just someone who has arrived along the same route, shaped by the same river, carrying the same quiet understanding of its shifting nature. A wooden canoe rests nearby, pulled partially onto the bank. It's simple but well used. Scratches along its side tell of repeated contact with rocks and shorelines. The interior holds faint traces of water, still reflecting light in small, uneven patches. A paddle rests against it, leaning at a slight angle. Looking at it, you can't help but think back to the night again, not as something distant, but as something that would have been experienced very differently from inside that narrow vessel. Every sound amplified, every movement of water translated directly into motion, every shift in current felt through the body rather than seen from a distance. Someone speaks nearby, not to you specifically, but within hearing range. A short exchange, something about timing, about the current being easier this morning, about making the next stretch before midday winds change the water again. You listen without interrupting, piecing together fragments of conversation that reflect practical knowledge of the river, knowledge built over time, not theory. This is not exploration for them. It is familiarity. Another traveler arrives from the path behind you, briefly slowing as they reach the group. There is a short greeting, a nod, a few exchanged words, and then they begin helping without needing further instruction. You notice how quickly roles form here. No formal structure, just immediate understanding of what needs to be done. The river seems to organize people without effort. You look back toward the water again. Now that you are standing among others, the river feels even more grounded, less like an isolated force, and more like a shared route that everyone here is temporarily aligned with, a place that continues regardless of who is present. Someone pushes the canoe slightly back toward the water. It shifts with a soft scrape against the ground. Not yet launched, just adjusted, prepared. The group continues its quiet preparations, and you remain at the edge of it, watching, adapting, absorbing the rhythm of this morning activity. And in a way, the contrast becomes even clearer now, because you realize something important. The night you experienced did not belong to a different world. It belonged to the same one these people are moving through now. The only difference is timing. You glance once more at the river's surface. It moves steadily, unchanged, unconcerned with whether it is being watched, traveled, or ignored. And yet, it has already shown you two entirely different versions of itself within the same cycle. One hidden, one revealed, both equally real. A voice calls out briefly, someone ready to move. The canoe is pushed further into the water, catching gently on the current before settling into alignment. Movement begins around you, not chaotic, not sudden, just coordinated continuation of what was already underway before you arrived. And you understand now that this is how the river lives its life, not in moments, but in constant transition, night into day, stillness into motion, isolation into shared passage. You take a small step closer to the edge as the group prepares to depart along the same current you followed through darkness. And as the canoe begins to drift, you realize something simple but final. The river was never waiting for you to understand it. It was only ever moving forward. The canoe slides farther into the river with a soft, controlled push. At first, it resists the current slightly, just enough for you to notice the tension between human intention and the river's natural pull. Then, slowly, it yields. The water takes it in, aligns it, and carries it forward as if it had always belonged there. The people around you move with quiet efficiency. One final adjustment, a last check of supplies, a brief exchange of words that you don't fully catch, but don't need to. Everything here is understood through repetition rather than explanation. The river has taught them what to expect, and they respond without hesitation. You remain near the edge, watching the canoe drift into the main current. It picks up speed gradually, not suddenly. The water doesn't rush, it persuades. It draws the vessel into its flow, guiding it along the path carved over centuries. The surface ripples gently around the hull, reflecting broken fragments of sky and trees. For a moment, you imagine it differently, not in daylight, but in the night you just lived through. That same canoe in that same position, but without sight. Only sound, only motion felt through wood and water. The thought lingers longer than expected. Someone steps beside you, one of the group, not the one who spoke earlier, but someone slightly older, carrying the calm familiarity of long experience with this river. They look out at the departing canoe, then briefly at you. Better in the morning, they say simply. Not a question, not a lesson, just a statement of fact, shaped by years of repetition. You nod slightly. Yes, you reply. A pause follows, not awkward, just natural. The kind of pause that exists when both people already understand the subject without needing to expand it. The river continues to carry the canoe downstream. It becomes smaller as it moves away, not just in distance, but in presence. The sound of its passage fades into the wider soundscape of flowing water, birds, wind through leaves. The group begins to disperse slowly. Some follow the path along the bank. Others return to preparing for departure. The sense of gathering dissolves into individual movement again, as if the river briefly brought everything together, only to release it once more. You stay where you are for a moment longer, looking at the water, the same water you stood beside in darkness, now fully visible, now shared, now part of a living, continuous flow of activity. And yet, something inside you still tracks the memory of the night, not as something separate, but as an overlapping layer beneath what you are seeing now. You notice how easily it would be to forget it, to let the daylight version overwrite everything, but it doesn't fully disappear. It sits beneath the surface of your awareness, like the deeper current beneath the visible one. The older traveler speaks again as they adjust a strap on their pack. Storm might come later in the week, they say casually, almost as if continuing an earlier thought. river will change again when it does. They don't elaborate. They don't need to, because you already understand what they mean. Not just weather, not just water levels, but everything that shifts with them. They start walking along the bank, not hurried, just steady. The rest of the group has already begun to spread out along the route, following the river's direction like a loose chain of movement. You hesitate for a brief moment, then you follow, not because you are told to, not because you must, but because it feels like the natural continuation of everything that has already happened. The path is clearer now than it was in the night, easier, safer, more defined. But as you walk, you realize something quietly shifting in your perception again. The river is no longer only something you observe. It is something you now measure yourself against. Every bend you pass is compared to how it felt in darkness. Every sound is layered with its memory. Every stretch of water carries both versions of itself simultaneously. And in that overlap, something new forms. Not fear, not comfort, but understanding. You pass the spot where you first stopped earlier, the bend where the water moved faster. It looks ordinary now, almost simple, and yet you remember how different it felt when you could not see it. How it became something else entirely when reduced to sound and suggestion. You keep walking. The group ahead moves steadily along the river's edge, spacing themselves naturally along the path. No one speaks much now. There is no need. The river fills the silence easily, and as you continue forward with them, you begin to notice something subtle but important. You are no longer waiting for the river to reveal itself. You are moving with it, and somewhere beneath the steady rhythm of footsteps, water, and wind, the understanding settles fully into place. The river does not belong to night or day. It belongs to flow, and you are simply passing through one of its many states. The walk continues in a steady rhythm now, the kind that forms naturally when a path has already been chosen for you by geography rather than decision. The river remains beside you, never leaving, never changing direction in any sudden way, just quietly guiding the landscape forward like a constant line through everything else. Ahead, the group spreads out a little more, not far apart, but enough that each person becomes part of their own small space within the same shared movement. Footsteps soften into the dirt. Occasional words are exchanged, but they are brief, practical, and quickly lost again in the sound of water and wind. You notice how the river behaves differently here. It is not the narrow, fast section from earlier, not the wide, mist-covered stretch of night. This part feels balanced, measured. The current is steady, but not forceful, and the surface carries a calmer pattern of ripples that move outward in soft, repeating lines. It looks almost organized, as if the water has found a comfortable pace between urgency and stillness. A bird circles low above the river before disappearing into the trees again. Another joins its call from farther upstream. Life continues in layers now, overlapping but no longer hidden. You walk past a section where the bank rises slightly, forming a natural ledge that gives you a higher view of the water. From here, you can see farther into the distance than before. The river stretches ahead in long, bending segments, each one disappearing behind the next, like a sequence of unfolding moments. You realize something as you look. In the night, you only ever experienced one segment at a time. One sound, one ripple, one uncertainty at a time. But now you can see how they connect, how each bend leads into another, how each section influences the next. What felt fragmented in darkness was always part of a continuous system. The group ahead slows briefly near a small resting point, just a patch of flatter ground where the river widens slightly. Some stop to adjust packs. Others drink water or check their footing. You pause as well, standing a little apart, letting your eyes follow the current. A man nearby, one of the travelers from earlier, kneels and runs his hand briefly through the water. He watches it for a moment, then nods to himself as if confirming something only he understands. You can feel the change coming, he says quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Another traveler responds without looking up. Wind shifts by afternoon. Simple exchange. No explanation needed. The river, again, is treated as something readable if you know how to look. You begin to understand that this knowledge is not spoken often because it doesn't need to be. It is lived, absorbed, passed through repetition rather than instruction. You crouch briefly at the edge again, letting your fingers hover just above the surface. The water is cold, even in daylight, constant, unchanging in that way, regardless of everything else. As your hand moves closer, you notice how the surface reacts, not dramatically, just slightly. Tiny ripples form outward, intersecting with the river's natural motion before dissolving again into its flow. It feels indifferent, not in a hostile sense, just in the sense that it does not respond to you in any meaningful way beyond physics. That realization carries something quiet with it. Not discomfort, not comfort, just clarity. You stand again. The group begins moving once more, and you fall into step without needing to be called. The path continues along a gentle curve where the river shifts direction again, this time moving away slightly before returning closer to the bank. The land adjusts with it, rising and falling in response to centuries of water carving its route. As you walk, your thoughts drift once more, not to specific moments, but to structure. You begin to see the night differently now, not as interruption, not even as challenge, but as limitation, a reduction of available information that forces the mind to reconstruct reality from fragments. And what you experienced was not something separate from this river. It was simply the same river, filtered through restricted perception. A rustle in the trees, a ripple in the water, a sound without visible source. All of it was still part of this same system, just incomplete. Ahead, the path begins to open into a broader stretch again, and the group gradually starts to space out further, each person finding their own rhythm within the same direction of travel. The older traveler from earlier falls back slightly, walking closer to you now. They glance at the river, then ahead, then back again. People think it gets quieter out here, they say after a moment. You listen, but it doesn't, they continue. You just learn what to ignore. The statement is simple, but it lands heavily in its simplicity because it connects directly to everything you've experienced since last night. The river has not changed. Your ability to interpret it has. You nod slowly, not needing to respond further. The conversation ends there, not because there is nothing more to say, but because there is nothing more that needs to be added. The group continues forward. The river flows beside you. The forest stretches on. The afternoon arrives slowly, almost unnoticed at first. There is no sharp transition, no moment where morning ends, and something entirely new begins. Instead, the light simply strengthens, deepens, and settles into a more consistent warmth that spreads across the river and the surrounding land. You realize it only after it has already happened. The shadows are shorter now. The air feels lighter, less damp than before. Even the river's surface has changed subtly, reflecting a steadier brightness that makes its movement easier to track from a distance. The group you've been walking with has loosened its formation further. Some are ahead now, some lag slightly behind, all still following the same general path along the river's edge. The need for close coordination has faded with the increasing clarity of the environment. You continue at a comfortable pace. The ground here becomes more compact, less uneven. Occasional patches of gravel appear near the bank, shifting softly underfoot. The river itself bends gently outward, creating a wider stretch that feels more open, less enclosed by trees. You notice how your attention changes with the time of day. In the night, every sound felt isolated, individual, significant. Now, sounds blend together into a broader background: bird calls, rustling leaves, distant movement in the water, none demanding immediate focus, all forming a continuous layer of awareness. The river no longer interrupts your perception. It supports it. Ahead, the older traveler slows slightly and falls into step beside you again. They don't speak immediately. They are watching the river. The same way they always seem to like it is something they read, rather than simply see. After a moment, they gesture slightly toward the water. This stretch floods sometimes, they say. When rain comes hard upstream, you look where they indicate. The bank here is lower, the soil darker, more compacted. You can see faint lines where water has risen in the past, leaving behind marks on the land, subtle reminders of times when this calm surface becomes something far less predictable. You nod, absorbing the information. They continue walking. The river's never really the same 2 days in a row, they add. Just looks that way when you're not paying attention. There is no emphasis in their voice, no attempt to impress or warn, just observation. You begin to see a pattern in how people here talk about the river. It is never described as fixed, only as something that changes in ways that are either noticed or missed. You walk for a while, in silence again. The group ahead passes a small cluster of trees where the river curves inward slightly, forming a quieter pocket of water. Here, the current slows and the surface becomes smoother, almost glass-like in places. You pause briefly at the edge of this section. The reflection here is clearer than anywhere else you've seen so far. You can see the sky, the trees, even your own shape distorted gently in the moving surface. It is not perfect, but it is readable, and that contrast returns to your thoughts again. Night versus day is not just visibility, it is resolution. You crouch slightly, observing how small particles drift through the water, tiny fragments carried along without effort or resistance. Some catch the light briefly before disappearing deeper into the flow. Everything here is in motion. Even what appears still is simply moving more slowly. You stand again as the group continues onward. The path begins to climb slightly now, rising above the river just enough to give a wider view of the landscape beyond. From here, you can see farther into the surrounding terrain, rolling forest, uneven patches of open land, and distant bends of the river that weave in and out of view. The scale of it becomes more apparent, not overwhelming, just expansive. You realize that the river is not just something you follow. It is something that structures the land around it. The older traveler speaks again as they walk. If you stay long enough, they say, you start to know its moods. You glance at them. Moods, you ask. They nod slightly. Some days it runs fast. Some days it drags. Sometimes it feels like it's pulling everything with it. Other times, it just carries. They pause briefly, considering their own words. It's not random, they add, just hard to read at first. You think about that, not as metaphor, but as observation, because you have already seen enough to understand that the river behaves consistently within its own system. What changes is not its nature, but your ability to recognize its patterns. The group ahead slows again near a wider bend where the river spreads out into a shallow, sunlit expanse. The water here is calmer, broken only by gentle ripples that radiate outward in soft, overlapping circles. Someone in the group calls out briefly, pointing toward the far side of the bend. A herd of animals stands there, partially hidden by trees. Not alarmed, just present, drinking or resting near the edge. There is no reaction of surprise, from the travelers, only acknowledgement, another part of the shared environment. You watch them for a moment before continuing. The river carries on beside you, unchanged by their presence, unchanged by yours, and yet everything around it continues to adjust, people moving, animals shifting, paths forming and reforming along its edge. You begin to understand something more clearly now. The river is not a background to this world. It is its structure. Everything else simply moves through it. As you continue walking, the light grows stronger still, reaching a point where the entire landscape feels fully present, no longer shifting between uncertainty and clarity, but stabilized in full visibility. And yet, even now, you remember, the night is not gone. It is only waiting, because rivers like this do not stop when the sun sets. They only change how they are understood. And that understanding, once gained, never fully disappears. The group keeps moving as the river settles into its steady afternoon rhythm. By now, the journey feels less like a sequence of events and more like a continuous alignment with the landscape itself. Footsteps fall in sync with the uneven ground. Conversations remain sparse, emerging only when necessary. Even silence feels structured here, held together by the constant presence of flowing water beside you. The river widens again ahead, and the air changes subtly as you approach it. There's more openness now, fewer trees crowding the banks, more sky reflected on the surface. You notice how the light behaves differently here compared to earlier stretches. It doesn't just illuminate, it spreads, softens, and flattens contrast. The river looks less segmented, more unified, as though the bends and currents are parts of a single continuous motion rather than separate features. You walk slightly closer to the edge without thinking about it. The older traveler notices, but doesn't comment. Instead, they simply adjust their pace to stay near. You get used to it, they say after a while, almost casually. To what, you ask? They gesture loosely toward everything: the water, the path, the land. All of it, the changes, the noise, the quiet. After a while, it stops feeling like different things. You look at the river as they speak. It moves steadily, unchanged in its core behavior. But you understand what they mean. At night, it felt fragmented, pieces of sound and movement that had to be assembled mentally. Now it feels continuous, but the continuity is not new. Only your perception of it is. A small bend in the river ahead creates a shallow, slow-moving pool where sunlight gathers more intensely. The surface here almost stops for a moment before continuing its flow, creating a visual illusion of stillness. You slow as you pass it. There's something almost deceptive about it. Not dangerous, just misleading in the way natural systems often are when observed without full context. A few people from the group pause briefly at this point, using the calmer water to refill containers or adjust their gear. Others continue forward, maintaining the river as a guiding line. You remain standing near the edge for a moment longer. Looking down, the water here is clearer than before. You can see small stones beneath the surface, their shapes distorted by gentle refraction. Tiny movements ripple across them as the current passes over. You notice something else now. Even in this calm section, the river is never fully still. There is always motion, always adjustment, always something shifting just beneath what appears stable. That realization connects back to everything you experienced in the night, but in a different way now, not as mystery, but as consistency. The older traveler steps beside you again. This part used to take longer to cross, they say. Before they cleared some of the upstream debris, you follow their gaze downriver. The mention of cleared is not elaborated on, but you understand enough. People do not simply observe this river. They actively interact with it when necessary, not to control it, but to work with it. You nod slightly. They continue walking without waiting for a response. You fall back into step. The group moves forward again, passing beyond the calm pool into a section where the river narrows slightly and picks up speed. The sound increases subtly, not loud, but more present now, filling the space between trees and footsteps. You notice how quickly your mind adjusts to each change. Slower water feels normal until faster water replaces it. Then that becomes normal. The baseline is always shifting, and yet nothing about the river itself has changed its fundamental nature. It is always moving, always adjusting to terrain, gravity, obstruction, and time. Ahead, the path begins to curve inland slightly, pulling away from the immediate edge of the water before returning again further ahead. The group spreads out a little more during this section, following different natural lines in the terrain. You find yourself walking closer to the older traveler again. Neither of you speaks for a while. The silence between you is not empty. It is filled with the shared presence of the river and the steady progression of movement. Eventually, they speak again. "You were here last night," they ask, not turning fully toward you. It is not a challenge, just recognition. You hesitate briefly. "Yes," you say. They nod once, as if confirming something they already assumed. "That changes how you see it," they say. You glance at the river. "I think it already changed it," you reply. A faint exhale, almost a chuckle, but not quite. "Good," they say simply. Nothing more is added, because nothing more is needed. The river continues alongside you, now bending gently through a more open stretch of land. The sky is brighter still, the air warmer, and the world feels fully awake in a way that contrasts sharply with the memory of the night you just lived through. But even as everything around you becomes clearer, one understanding remains constant. The river is not different. Only the way you experience it is layered across time. Night showed you its uncertainty. Day shows you its structure. And between them lies the full reality always moving, always present, always beyond a single moment of perception. You keep walking forward with the group, following the river as it leads deeper into the landscape, carrying with it everything you have seen, heard, and now quietly understood. The afternoon begins to settle into something more stable now, not in the sense that anything becomes still, because nothing here truly does, but in the sense that your awareness stops needing to constantly adjust. The river, the path, the group moving alongside it, all of it starts to feel like a single, continuous system you've become part of rather than something you are actively interpreting. The older traveler drifts a little farther ahead again, merging back into the flow of others. You continue at your own pace. The river bends outward once more, opening into a broad stretch where the water slows and spreads. The surface reflects the sky more evenly here, broken only by faint ripples that move outward in soft, overlapping patterns. The banks widen and the terrain flattens, making the landscape feel less compressed, more open. You notice small changes in how the group behaves in this section. People speak a little more freely now. Movements are less cautious. Even the spacing between travelers becomes more relaxed, as if the environment itself has lowered the need for constant attention. But you still find your eyes returning to the river, not out of concern, out of comparison. You can't help it anymore. Every section you pass carries an echo of how it felt in darkness, not as memory alone, but as a second layer of understanding that sits beneath what you're seeing now. Here, the water looks calm. Last night, this same stretch would have been reduced to sound, faint motion, and uncertainty stretching across invisible distance. You walk along a slightly elevated ridge beside the river, giving you a clearer view of both the water and the land beyond it. From here, the scale of the river becomes more apparent again. It is not just a line through the landscape. It is a shaping force. The forest bends around it. The land slopes toward it. Even the vegetation seems arranged in response to its presence. Ahead, the group slows near another informal gathering point, less structured than the earlier one, but still clearly used. A few scattered logs lie near the edge of the bank. Flattened grass suggests repeated resting or stopping. Some people from your group begin to pause here again, taking advantage of the open space. You slow as well, not stopping fully, but observing. A child no older than early adolescence runs briefly along the edge of the clearing before being called back by an adult. The movement is quick, light, unburdened by the careful awareness of the adults around them. It stands out because it contrasts sharply with how you experienced this river just hours ago. In the night, even the smallest sound felt weighted with uncertainty. Here, movement is simply movement. You sit briefly on one of the logs near the edge. The wood is warm from the sun, dry, worn smooth by repeated use. From here, you can see the river more fully again, stretching in both directions, carrying everything forward with steady persistence. You notice how easily your mind now reconstructs its structure, where it bends, where it slows, where it would accelerate if the terrain changes again. The older traveler eventually sits a short distance away, resting their pack beside them. They glance at the river for a while before speaking again. You notice more after a night like that, they say. It isn't phrased as a question, but you answer anyway. Yes, you reply. They nod slowly. Most people think it makes them uneasy. They continue. But it usually just makes them pay attention. You look at the river as they speak, and you realize they're right, but not in the way it might first sound. It's not just attention. It's layering. You are no longer seeing the river once. You are seeing it twice, simultaneously. Once through light, once through memory, and neither version cancels the other. A few travelers begin to stand again, preparing to continue. The group reforms gradually, returning to motion without urgency. You rise as well. The log behind you creaks slightly as weight leaves it, and you fall back into step with the others as the river begins to narrow again ahead, drawing the path forward. The sound of water changes subtly here, becoming slightly more focused, more directional. The current tightens, moving with more energy through a narrower channel. You recognize this now not as unfamiliar, but as another variation of the same system. The river does not behave differently. It simply expresses itself differently depending on structure. The group moves through the narrowing stretch, and you follow, watching how the water responds to every shift in terrain, how it speeds, how it slows, how it adjusts without hesitation. And somewhere in that steady movement, something else becomes clear again. The river is not a place you pass through. It is a process you align with. Night showed you its hidden complexity. Day shows you its visible structure. And together, they form something complete enough to understand, but never complete enough to fully contain. You continue walking. The river continues flowing, and both remain unchanged by your understanding, yet somehow forever altered in the way you now experience them. The path tightens again as the river draws closer to the land, narrowing into a section where water and earth seem to negotiate space more directly. Here, the bank is less forgiving. Roots extend outward from the trees, like exposed veins. The soil is darker, compacted, shaped by repeated passage and seasonal change. You step carefully, without thinking about it anymore, your body already adapting to the uneven ground, already reading the subtle cues in terrain that would have gone unnoticed before last night. The group ahead adjusts as well, spacing themselves more deliberately as the path becomes less uniform. Conversation fades again into a quieter rhythm, not silence, but something structured around movement and attention. The river here is louder, not in a chaotic sense, but in concentration. The water has less space to spread out, so its movement becomes more defined, more audible. Every small disruption, rock, bend, shallow dip, creates a clearer response in sound and motion. You notice how easily your mind now categorizes these changes. Fast section, narrow bend, calmer return. It's almost automatic now. But beneath that clarity, the memory of the night still exists, not as contradiction, but as foundation. You reach a point where the path rises slightly above the river again, giving you a wider vantage point. From here, the landscape opens in layers. The river winds through alternating stretches of forest and open ground, sometimes disappearing behind vegetation, sometimes revealing long, uninterrupted segments of flow. You realize something as you look across it. In daylight, the river looks like a path. In darkness, it becomes a presence. Same structure, different interpretation. The group continues ahead, and you follow, stepping over a fallen branch that has begun to dry under the sun. Its bark flakes slightly under pressure, releasing a faint scent of wood and earth. A few travelers ahead pause near a small break in the trees, where the river bends outward again. There is something different here, not in danger, not in urgency, just in attention. People are looking at the water more closely. You approach slowly, noticing what they're seeing. The river widens into a shallow stretch, and beneath the surface, something unusual is visible. A pattern in the sediment, lines carved into the riverbed that curve and intersect in ways that don't match natural flow alone. They suggest older movement, perhaps a change in the river's course in the past, or the remnants of human interference, long since softened by time and water. Someone near you speaks quietly. Old channel, they say. No elaboration needed. You study it for a moment longer. What looks stable now has clearly shifted before. The river has not always taken this exact path. It has moved, adjusted, reclaimed space, and left behind traces of its previous routes. You begin to understand the deeper truth behind everything you've seen. The river is not just changing across time. It is rewriting itself continuously. The group begins moving again, stepping past the observation point and continuing along the bank. You follow. The terrain gradually becomes smoother again, less fragmented, more consistent underfoot. Trees thin slightly, allowing more uninterrupted light to reach the ground. The river, too, becomes calmer here, spreading into a broader, slower moving section. You find yourself walking closer to its edge once more, not because you need to, but because you want to see it more clearly now, not just as something that moves through darkness or light, but as something that maintains identity across both. A bird lands briefly on a low branch above the water, tilts its head, then takes off again almost immediately. The movement feels simple now, unremarkable in isolation, but part of a larger continuity. The older traveler appears beside you again, matching your pace for a few steps. They don't look at you immediately, just at the river. After a moment, they speak. Most people only see the surface, they say. Doesn't matter if it's night or day. That's still true. You glance toward them. They continue, but you've seen enough now to know there's always something underneath. They don't clarify whether they mean the water or something else. Then they drift forward again, rejoining the group without waiting for a response. You continue walking in silence. The river stretches ahead, wide and steady, reflecting the sky in shifting fragments. And as you move with it, you realize something quietly forming in your understanding. You are no longer learning the river as a place. You are learning it as a system of perception. Night showed you what happens when that system is limited. Day shows you what happens when it is restored. And the river itself remains indifferent to both, flowing forward, carrying sediment, sound, movement, and memory without distinction. You keep walking, and the river keeps moving, not separately, but together, in the same unbroken direction. The light begins to soften again as the group continues along the river's long curve. Not darkness returning, not even close, but the sun shifting lower in the sky, stretching shadows across the land in longer, slower shapes. The day is moving toward its quiet closing phase, though no one around you seems to treat it as an ending. It is simply another part of the same flow of time, just as the river is another part of the same flow of water. You walk without speaking for a while. The path has become familiar now, in a way it wasn't earlier. Not because you memorized it, but because your attention has adapted to reading it continuously. Every bend, every change in terrain, every shift in sound from the water feels like information you now automatically understand rather than consciously decode. The river is wider again here, slower, almost reflective in the way it carries the sky back toward itself. The surface is broken only by occasional ripples that expand outward in soft circles before dissolving again into the larger current. You notice how differently you experience it now compared to when you first stood beside it in darkness. Back then it was fragmented, a splash without origin, a sound without shape, a presence without confirmation. Now it is continuous, but not simplified. It has not become less complex. You have simply learned how to see it as a whole. The group ahead begins to slow as the path opens into a broader clearing along the riverbank. This place feels less like a passage and more like a resting point shaped by repeated use over time. The grass is worn flatter. The soil is firmer. The trees stand slightly farther back, as if giving the river more space to breathe. People begin to settle here again. Some set down their packs. Some sit near the water. Others remain standing, looking out across the river, as if deciding whether to continue further or pause for the evening. You stop as well, not because you must, because the rhythm of movement naturally allows it now. The older traveler is nearby again, though not directly beside you. Close enough to speak if needed, distant enough to remain in their own thoughts. For a while, no one says anything. The river fills the space between people easily. Then, quietly, the older traveler speaks. "It'll be different again tomorrow," they say. You look toward them. They are still watching the water, not waiting for a response, just studying it as something that has always been true. You understand what they mean now, without needing explanation. The river will shift overnight. The light will change. The sounds will reorganize themselves again. And the same place you stood in today will not feel exactly the same when you return to it. You turn your gaze back to the water. It moves steadily forward, carrying reflections of the sky, fragments of light, and the subtle evidence of everything that has passed through it. And you realize something final, not dramatic, not sudden, but complete in its simplicity. The river was never a single experience. It was always a continuum of experiences layered over time. Night showed you its uncertainty. Day showed you its clarity. Travel showed you its continuity. And together, they revealed something that does not change regardless of how it is seen. The river is never still, but it is always itself. You take one last long look across its surface. Then you begin walking again with the group, following the river as it continues into the distance, carrying everything you have seen: light, darkness, sound, silence, movement, and memory, forward without pause. And as the landscape slowly opens ahead of you, the understanding settles fully. Not the river changes for you. You change within the river, and it keeps flowing either way.